name is Chef David Wolfman, and I am from Hawklip First Nations in Lillooet, BC. And again, thank you for allowing me to come and do this talk. I would like to do a land acknowledgement to start with the land that I am on, as well as the land that you're on. So this land that I am standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga, the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, as well as the Mohawk territory as well. And so now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered, where I am, by the Treaty 13, which is signed with the Mississauga and New Credits and William Treaties and the Chippewa Band. So thank you again for having me here. Now, I have the lecture that I'm going to be doing today, or talking about today, is I've namely called it The Past is the Future, talking about Indigenous culinary techniques, not to mention gathering principles and ways of life, as I want to call it, for Indigenous people. Now, before I start, I'd like to discuss and talk about the National Indigenous Peoples Day month with you. This year has been significant for all the wrong reasons, with all the findings of all the unmarked graves surrounding the residential school. And although in the past, this day or month has been symbolic, but not really that meaningful. And I believe in order to for reconciliation to happen, the truths need to be heard. And I know this, I believe this is stirring up a host of challenges for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And if you feel you want to do something about this, I will post some suggestions at the end of my presentation. I didn't want to start the day without chatting about that. And I will open the, or we will, I should say, open the microphone at the end of our conversation for you to ask me any questions about my presentation, which I would love to answer. Now, I just have to see if I have control here. Oh, do I not have? I'm sorry, I'm just, oh, there we go. So that was my land acknowledgement. So I want to talk a bit about where I grew up. I grew up in downtown Regent Park. My mom from Hawklip First Nations got married, left the reserve, and met my father. And so I grew up and spent all of my life, or a good piece of my life, as what I would call an urban Indigenous person. One of the things that I always wanted to learn more about is the ways that my mom cooked food. So I remember one time sitting with my mom, I was 9 years old, and she was cooking some food, and I snuck in the kitchen for the main reason that I was hungry. And not hungry for knowledge and skills, which I later incidentally acquired from this, but I was hungry for food because she was making homemade bread. And I remember when I snuck in there, my mom said, "What are you doing in here?" And I said, "I'm here to help." And I think that was the first step into the kitchen for me to become part of working with my mom. Now, as I was working with my mom, I was basically just stirring the stew. My mom took some bread out immediately out of the oven. It just came out, and she said, "Look at all these broken pieces. We should be eating this." And I thought, wow, this is great. And as we were eating it, I was developing a relationship with my mom, talking about the stories. You see, my mom really yearned for going back home. She left there, coming to the city. And she would always talk about the mountains that she missed, and the ways that she missed, and some of the things. And as a young man at that time, I didn't really understand all of them. So for me, as a young Indigenous person, I was like, "Tell me more about this, and how did you live?" And my mom would talk about the salmon and the different types of things. So I eventually went out and took a trip out to the West Coast. And unfortunately, the first 2 times that I went out there, I never made it to my mom's home. Something I didn't realize as not being from that area, is that when you were driving, we landed in Vancouver, went to Chilliwack to see a couple of my aunts, and driving to where my mom's reserve is right up in the mountains, which is also called Avalanche Country. And so we want to go back home, as I would say, and the roads were closed. So I said, well, let's go the other way. So we have to go all the way around the mountain, and it's going to take a few hours. And so we ended up going to another one of my aunts. So I never actually made it out there until, unfortunately, after my mom had passed. But when I did go out there, I met a whole lot of my cousins. Now, my mom was one of 10 siblings. And by the time I had gotten out there, they already had not just children, but grandchildren. So now when I was driving out there, we're passing a bunch of wrecks of sitting on the riverbed. And I said to my cousin, what are these? And my cousin was telling me, although each family has a certain way of making racks and drying fish. And I thought, well, that's great. So can we go down and get some? They said, no, it needs to dry for a period of time, sometimes 2 to 3 weeks. And so I thought, wow, this is fascinating. This is great. Now, when I went out there, I at the time, had been still am a certified chef. So when I went out there, all my cousins were saying, "Oh, I really want to learn how to make a hollandaise. I really want to learn how to cook certain foods." And I was doing the same thing, saying, "I really want to learn our traditional ways." So that was one of the things that I had that I wanted to learn. Now, when we think of indigenous foods and indigenous ways, um, the way that everybody caught their food and the method that they hunted was really fascinating. As a matter of fact, I remember sitting with one of the elders who was one of my cousins, and he was talking to me about the time to go, to knowing when it was the time to go and get fish. Of course, I had hundreds of questions for him, and he said what they relied on was ecological indicators, because he noticed that I kept pulling out my phone, and he kept saying, we didn't have iPhones back then. We would listen to the environment, and the environment would talk to us. And he was a bit of a fun guy. I thought, are you okay? Art? And he says, no, we just listen. And he said, can you listen? Can you hear that? And I thought, I don't hear anything. He says, I'm joking. But what he would, what he said to me is that they would look for a yellowish, orangish buttercup. And when that buttercup came out of the ground and opened, that meant it was time to go down to the river to get salmon. Now, this is in the mountains in the West Coast. This is in the Hot Club area here. So it took a couple of days to, by the time you got down there, way back in the day, when they would trek down there and catch fish. Now, they had a couple of other things. They also, when they would go down and catch the fish, they would use either nets or spears. Now, there was also the spring salmon, which is a nice bright red. So when the red rose would appear, that would be the time for them to go down and get the spring salmon. Now, when they did catch the fish, whether it was the first catch, the spring salmon or the sockeye, depending on which one, they would go down and they would gut the salmon. And what they would do is they would take the innards out of the salmon. They would take some of the salmon to bring back to the reserve, and then they would bury a huge amount of that salmon in the sand right next to the river. And part of what they were doing was they would take the innards out to share with the bears, because they believed that if they didn't share it with the bears would be hungry and the bears would be looking for food. They also said that they're not the only ones on the land. So this was a really fascinating story to me. I was like, wow, that's really a neat way of looking at the environment. Then when they would bring the salmon back, they would share it within the community. They also had a ceremony that they did for the first salmon that was brought in. When they did bury that salmon, and what they would do is they would come back to it to prepare it. Now, when they went down there, it was spring, it was very cool. As a matter of fact, as soon as the sun dropped down right along the Fraser River, just outside of Lillooet, it's very cold at night. Even in the summer, it drops quite a bit of temperature. You can imagine it's in the mountains. And so the salmon wouldn't go bad, but in order to dry the salmon, what they would have to do is they would have to wait till the temperature was correct. And again, this is where Art said to me, We didn't check our phones or check the newspaper to see the temperature. What we did is we listened, and there was a grasshopper, and some people say crickets, but there was a grasshopper. When the grasshopper would get warm, they would rub their wings together to cool down, and then made a clicking sound. And that same clicking sound, there was a word in our language that they called that sound. And that clicking sound was the same sound that when you took your knife and cut along the back of the salmon to cut the bones, it was that same sound. So they used the language to identify that. And they said, now it's time to go down to the river to dry it. So then they would go down after they heard that sound, because then they knew that the environment was warm enough that if they hung their salmon, that the sun was warm enough in the daytime to dry it out properly. And they were drying it not just so they would have another method of eating food, but they would dry enough so they would have salmon throughout the year and be able to share it too. One of the most common things was when they would come up, and I did go there once when they came back, and they said, we need to stop by to all of these people's houses because they can't go back, they can't go down to the river. And I even remember the first time I went down there, I was pretty young, and it was challenging for me because it was very steep rocks to go down there. So when we think of this method of what I would call conserving the earth, I remember my cousin Grace was also talking about it. So I got to meet a lot of my different cousins there. And she used to weave baskets. Actually, she still does. But she learned that from our grandmother or great grandmother. And they would weave these baskets. And she showed me these baskets. And they were really red inside from staining, from picking berries. And she said, these are the ones that we take down there. And I thought, well, that's pretty small. And she said, well, this was the amount that you're supposed to take. You weren't supposed to take any more, because if you took too much, then other people wouldn't have it. And so the more I thought about this, growing up as an urban indigenous person, the more I thought, wow, they're really in touch with the land and making sure that we don't take as much. When you really think of it, it's a far cry from the practice that we do today, or I do, or people in the city where we have, jumbo cars or jumbo SUVs, getting our jumbo packages from these big stores that make everything in mass quantities, and we take them home into our, put them in our jumbo fridges, and then we end up throwing them into our garbage cans, which are jumbo as well. And when we really think about it, they take it to jumbo landfills, and it really made me start to think about, wow, this is really affecting our environment. We're buying food in such large quantities, not sharing. It was completely different than what I learned from growing up. One of the other things I learned while I was out there is that the connection that they had with each other. I also learned that there was a bonding with the environment. There was also trust, sharing with others, cooperation. And I'm not saying that we don't do that here today, but there was also caring for strangers, conserving for the future, which was something that I thought, oh, of course I'm recycling my water bottles, and I'm trying to do the best I can. And so these, when I came back the first time, I thought this really opened up my eyes to think of, wow, this is true sustainability. This is like, this is something that's amazing. And I remember coming back and talking to some of my aunts and uncles and cousins and saying, how do you say sustainability in our language? Because I want to know more about it. And that actually set a whole frenzy with a whole bunch of them, because they didn't know, there was no word. They said there is no word. And they ended up coming up with a word. And we had to do a lot of research. They did some research, and we ended up doing some. When you really think about it, they said this word actually meant the way of life. So it's a yuck way, or as my uncle would say, a yuck wayam. And it was really interesting, the language that they had. And this actually impressed me, since it wasn't about making sure that you do your share. It was the way for the whole community. It wasn't a suggestion as well. You were actually obliged to do this, to take care of the land. It wasn't an option. And not only that, but the more that I thought about it, the more that I realized that it was right within the community. And when we think of when we look at sustainability, sort of that trendy sustainability, we would think of like the 100-mile diet. We would think of eating local, the food to table movement. And these are all fantastic ways of sustainability. But again, I was looking at what I knew as an urban indigenous person and what my family had done. And I was trying to see how can I bring these two together? You know, the whole food diet, you know, even paleo and keto diets of looking after eating certain foods, maybe not eating, drinking almond milk. It uses a lot of water. Those types of things really came forefront in my mind. Um, and then I sat and I thought, is this my imagination, or in order to find the balance of health and lifestyle, uh, instead of looking into the future, maybe I'm looking in the wrong direction. So I should be looking back. Now, one of the other things that they used to translate this was called Takmith Katha, which meant to look to the earth, to look after the land. Um, and depending on the elder that we talked to, they would also say that meant it was a circle. It was a circle of us as a community. We didn't look at you as being different than the plants, as the fish, as the bears, because we all shared that. And from a Hoklop perspective, sustainability was knowing right from wrong. And doing the wrong thing traditionally would lead to be shunned. And when you think of being shunned at a time like that, it was, according to my uncle, like a death sentence, because everybody needed each other to survive. Within the community, there were certain people that did certain things, and we brought those together. So if I was the local cook in the community, I would cook. If you were the person that got fish, you would do that. And so all of us had an integral part of our community. When you really think about it, we were taking care of the plants, the trees, the water, the salmon, the bears, and the grasshoppers. So when I think back to sustainability, the more I look back at the trip that I took, it was a trip that I was actually taking for me. I didn't realize this. And then it hit me when I was there. It hit me that I was part of a pack. I remember when people said, "Hey, you're my cousin," and it wasn't just like, "Hey, cousin," which is what they did too, right? But it was fantastic that I was part of them. Come on over here, and I just felt it was almost like a big warm blanket being wrapped around me wherever I went. It was something that I had never felt before. You know, my mom moved to Toronto. The closest relative we had was in Six Nations, where his sister moved, and we didn't really know family like everybody else. Everybody had an aunt and uncle. I mean, we had aunts and uncles that weren't real aunts and uncles that my mom and dad knew for a long time. So to me, it was really neat because I didn't. I realized that I was part of this pack, not a wolf pack, but a pack that every part of what they did, they looked after each other, they worked together. And what more, I said, "Wow, how long have you guys been doing this?" And they just kind of laughed at me. "We've been doing this forever. This is the way." And they kept saying the way. And I thought, wow, this is great. So they've been doing this both naturally and instinctively. And to me, it was really, really neat. Now, my lessons in life, growing up as a city slicker, have been the total opposite of I got to call them my peoples, or I call them my peeps when I was out there. My peeps lessons for thousands of years. In Toronto, I learned to protect myself, think for myself, to speak for myself, to physically fight for myself, to learn to be street smart, city wise, not to trust strangers, to be one step ahead of everybody else. I even was selling newspapers when I was 8 years old. But I learned to listen to streetcar bells and school bells, not grasshoppers. I learned to read flyers for sales, not listen to for crickets, or look to flowers. I learned the quickest way to get to point A to point B on my bike without getting clobbered by a bus, a car, or another biker. I learned to parallel park a station wagon by the time I was 16. And it didn't matter about the people next door to me. I didn't even know their names. As a matter of fact, I learned not to look them in the eyes. Mom said, don't talk to strangers. And it was a strange way. And the majority of the indigenous people in this country actually now live in cities, and it makes it harder and harder for us to pass down this traditional knowledge with each other. And our languages are slowly disappearing, the less that we use. So some indigenous people go out of their way to bring that back, and it's one of the greatest things now that we're seeing in schools is that they're teaching our language, or not our language, but the languages of the indigenous people. So when we really look at how our methods of cooking and indigenous cuisine and foods were shared, a lot of times they were done around storytelling in circles. And they were passed to us. And like one of the stories that my aunt told me, she said, I'm sharing this with you. And I was writing it down. I said, am I allowed to share this? And she said, yes, please share it. Because it was really interesting, because I said, I was always told that when you learn things to not to share them with everybody. And she said, this is part of our culture and we must keep it alive. And I was also told that we need to keep the story part true, but we can add some of our colors and our own flavors to the story. So these types of stories were told to babies, to children, to youth over and over again. Everybody in the community was telling the same story. So when our youth came to hear about how food was picked or grown, it was the same story that was told all over. You know, today, if I come over and talk to the neighbor's child, they're gonna go, what are you doing? Get away from my kid. And don't be telling them your way or anything. So it was complete opposite of what I had learned. When we actually look at the environment, we look at having this viewpoint of protecting it. We actually look at it, and as my, now I never met my grandparents, they had both passed before. So most of my aunts and uncles, some of them were much older than me, were like a grandparent. But I remember them saying that one of the stories that they would tell, that they did not inherit the land from the earth, but from we did not inherit from the earth, from our ancestors as well. We inherited it from our children. So it was up to us to look after this land and to look after the food. Now, I remember when I did my apprenticeship years and years ago, I remember working in the National Club, as you can see the picture here of me. That's when I was 16 years old. I think that was 20 years ago. Okay, so it wasn't 20 years ago. It was a few years ago when I was there, and that was my third day on the job in the National Club. And the chef that I worked for was very frugal. People that worked for him called him other names, but he would waste nothing. He would take a green onion, he would trim the top off. The top would go into the stock pot, the bottom. The green section would be used in this recipe. Part of the white would be used in this recipe. Everything there. When we cut a tomato, the tops of the tomato would be cut up and used. The very top would be cut into little pieces, which would be spread on top of one of the green salads. The sliced tomatoes were we had a tomato and a cheddar tomato and cheese platters that we served. So every part, and the bottom of the tomato would be used in the stock pot. So everything was like that. Now, I grew up that my mom taught me that. And then when I worked with this chef also was that way. Now, he was screaming and always mad that everybody was wasting food and wasting oxygen and wasting everything. But I just thought that this was the way. He was very similar. Now, my mom never screamed at me, but it was just a way. And I thought that all food service was this way, because this is how I also grew up. Now, later on, working for the Marriott, when I worked for the Marriott, you can see the picture on the right here. This is when I was, how old was I at the Marriott? I believe I was 29 there, on the right side with my salmon there. I was a head chef at the Marriott at that time. And we made food every day. And we were on a cyclical menu, which just basically meant the menu would recycle over and over. But we couldn't serve anything left over today for tomorrow. So The art of my job was to try and use everything up. They wouldn't let us take food home, and we couldn't resell it because they had a strict menu, and they said, no, you can't do that. I was getting tired of throwing away food. I said, we can't do this. Why don't we give it to a food bank? No, because if you put it at the back door, you'll be putting other things, people will be stealing food. And it was something that was like, wow, I know this is a business, but we're throwing this food out. So I found a ways that I could have a chef special. I implemented it just because I didn't want to see, and I didn't want to throw away food. I think to me, it's something that's crazy, that we have to find ways of not wasting food. Now, fast forward, I've been a prof at George Brown College now for 26 years. Now, when I first started teaching there, I was learning a lot of different ways. I was teaching actually an Indigenous cuisine and culture program, and I loved it. Now we implement that as part of our regular schedules. But you can imagine it's over $2 million of food that we purchase there for our students to learn. So imagine if students were making lasagna today. Each student would have, half a kilo of ground beef, 2 onions, tomatoes, tomato paste, noodles. There would always be leftover foods because students wouldn't show up. They didn't use it all. And so we had a huge amount of food that was also getting wasted. So a couple of the chefs there came up with this great plan because we looked at, we can't be wasting this food. And so we broke it down to 3 different areas. Now, by the way, sometimes the wrong calculation was made for the recipes. Other times the shipping the food didn't come in on the right day. Sometimes the ingredients were poor quality, so we'd have to get more in because maybe it was a freshness issue and we wanted our students to have it. But there was a lot of reasons why we would have a lot of leftover foods. So what we decided to do is we decided to break it down into 3 different places. So any food that was not touched, we sent it back to be reissued. Any food that was raw and cut up and not cooked, we send it to our local food bank. And then the students paid a materials fees that they used the food, and then we ended up that they would keep it. Now, some of the foods that the kids made said, oh, I don't eat this or I don't like this, they wouldn't get it. So we opened up a student food bank where we gave away free meals to the students. So by doing so, we reduced our food waste by 85%. It took 2 years to do it, and it was challenging to implement. It also meant that we had to do a lot of different practices in the way we approached our food. But to me, I thought, okay, this is another great thing that has been happening in our industry. And it's a way that we can go without utilizing food. There's a lot of restaurants pre-COVID and even now that's at the end of their shifts, there are companies that will pick up that food and bring it to shelters. So to me, that is a great method that I'm very proud of seeing that our school is doing. Now, when we look at food, before I came to George Brown College, I used to run a catering company. And what I would do with all my leftover foods is I made sure that I fed people. And we had, at that time, we had, because it's a community center, we had just tables where people would sit in the daytime. So what I used to do is I had a wedding, I had a function, I had an event, I would take any leftover foods, put it in the takeout containers, bring it upstairs and let people help themselves. That worked to a point, but then there was a lot of food. Sometimes there was no food. And so what I decided to do was to have a community lunch that I developed using indigenous foods. And it was really neat because some of the people that were coming there was street people and they said, oh, I've never tried venison or I've never tried caribou, especially curried. So to me, that was a great opportunity to practice sustainability, to utilize that food. You know, when we look at our way of food, I was with a friend of mine who's a hunter, and he would go hunting and then he would bring food over to, he knew I was a chef. So he said, do you know how to butcher? I said, of course I know how to butcher. He said, I need some help butchering a little bit of deer meat. And so I came over to his house and it was actually elk, it wasn't deer. He had 2 whole elks in the back of his truck, with there. And I said, okay, I thought you had some meat that you needed diced up. So we got into the practice of doing this every year. And then we bought backpack machines, and I would divvy up all of the meat, and we'd take extra meat to our neighbors. And it was a really neat thing to do. One of the cool things is that I said to him is, I want the bones. Now, when I was back home, I remember talking to my uncle, and I said, I'm going to make you some bone broth. It's this new trend. And he said, it's not a new trend, David. He says, we've been doing this for years and years in making bone broth. And it was usually given to the elders because he said a lot of the times the younger people didn't want it, but they would put the bones in water and boil it and simmer it. And it's really good for you. And so I remember when I was telling him, this is a new thing, and it's not a new thing. So now the other thing about Rob, when he used to come over, is one of the times he called me up and he said, I only got one elk. And so I would go over to his house, and I opened up the back of his truck. And it's funny because he grew up on the land. And so he said, we're going to do this in the garage, because it was, pretty cold. It's November. We're going to do this in the garage. And I thought, really? And he says, I bought new boxes to butcher on. And I was going, what do you mean new boxes? That we should be doing this on cutting boards. And not realizing that he had to spread the animal out onto boxes. And so he had brand new cardboard boxes. But when he said, I think one of the legs fell off when I was driving, and we opened it up and the whole leg was missing. I said, how can you lose a leg on the highway? And he said, I'm kidding. What I did is I have a friend of mine who's a fisherman. And so I cut off a leg and I gave it to him, and he gave me all of his fish. And with that fish, I have another friend who likes fish, and he's a duck hunter. So I got some ducks. So he said, if you help me butcher all of this, I'll give you some ducks and some fish, as well as you can have the bones. And I said, I want certain cuts. And because I'm a chef, I also know the different cuts of the animal. So to me, it was really cool that I could butcher them up, and I could say, this one was for stewing, this one's for kebabs, because he said before they would just do two, they would do steaks, and then the rest would be ground up for sausages and those types of things. So I did a lot of trimming. I mean, I know how to do it. It was really cool because I would butcher it, put it there, and then he would backpack it and label it. So we had a production team going pretty well. But it really brought me back to that way of the community. Here he is taking this food and sharing it, and exchanging it. So now we also had fish and we had duck, and he would tell me stories. He's from Ontario. He's Ojibwe from Ontario. And he would tell me stories of their local people on how they caught the fish and what they would do with the fish, and they would trade it. And so to me, that was really neat. And, one of the other things about being a part of this community is that as a chef, now, as you heard earlier, my wife and I, my wonderful wife, Marlene Finn, and I wrote this cookbook called Cooking with the Wolfman. And in doing so, and as a professor and as a chef, I wanted to make sure that these recipes work. And I worked in the Marriott, and as a professor, we have recipes. And when a recipe doesn't work, we see 24 students that don't do it right, times 4 classes today, times 8 classes all week, it's 32. So we know when recipes work or don't work, and the explanations are on them. So I really want to make sure when we were writing our cookbook that our recipes work. So I would test the recipes 3 or 4 times. I would sometimes even send some recipes out for other people to test. So when you have that much food, and we got to do 2 more recipes tomorrow, the fridge is full behind me, the freezer is full. So what are we going to do with this leftover food? I usually take a whole lot to my father, but I also have neighbors, including Murray, who lived next door. He was 100. Unfortunately, he just passed away at 100. But I remember phoning him up saying, hey, do you like smelts? He goes, I love smelts. And I remember going over there saying, is there anything you don't like? He says, if you're cooking it, I'm eating it. And he loved eating all my foods. But again, I brought that community sense back too, to going to my different neighbors. I even had a new neighbor. I remember bringing food over to one of my new neighbors, just moved in, and they said, what do you want? I said, I don't want nothing. I have some extra food. I'm a cook, so if you don't want it, I'll bring it to the other neighbor. But it was really neat, and it reminded me of what one of the elders said to me, is that you probably don't even know your neighbor's name. Some of your neighbors. And I said, yeah. And they said, well, when I was back home, they would say, we're going to go over and visit this. Or they related to us? No, they aren't, but we're going to go and see them. And it was something that was really neat. And again, it brings me back to our way of life. You know, the way that we look at food, the way that we look at preparing food. Now, when we look at food, you know, let's talk a little bit about different ways that different groups of people looked at food. I'm now going to talk about indigenous. Now, there's a difference between indigenous, what I call indigenous foods, to traditional, to cultural. So let's look at indigenous first. I believe that indigenous foods are foods that were here pre-contact. So in other words, pre-contact. So they were here, the buffalo, the caribou, the salmon, fiddleheads, milkweed pods. So there's a lot of things that were here before, and I call those indigenous. And then I look at what I call tradition. A lot of people would say, oh, Bannock is indigenous. Bannock, you know, they've been doing that for a long time. Well, that was a recipe that was shared with us and brought into what I want to say into our community. And we started to prepare that. We shared recipes. You know, we found leavening agents that were shared with us, and we basically married them together. So now this Bannock recipe, or maybe some types of bread recipes, were brought in as part of our culture. So now we have that. Now we're still using maybe some indigenous products with some of these new, what I want to call traditional products, because now we've been doing this for years and years, and even generations. Not only has it become part of our traditions, but it's also become part of our customs and part of our culture. So that's the difference, what I would call indigenous to traditional cultural. I'm not saying that there aren't some indigenous foods that are wrapped into our cultures and our traditions as well. But when we look to the foods and we start looking, so if we look to, for example, let's look to the north, to the Inuit people. When they would get seal, for example, or whale, or whatever protein they would get, they wouldn't cook the food. As a matter of fact, it was customary, and by the way, I went up there and I thought this was, wow, strange to me, that right after they took an animal, they would eat the liver, they would eat it, they would give it to the elders, and I thought, oh, and they said, well, that's because it's warm, it's, you know, because everything up there is freezing, you know, if you think about this being for generations and generations. And the oils that they got from the animals, like for example, whale, they would use that for heating, not for cooking. And I remember being up there and doing an event where I took some meat that they had, some muskox, and cooked it, and did a vol au vent with, I brought all kinds of fiddleheads. Don't forget, it's 1,000 miles above the tree line. So I brought up fiddleheads, asparagus, I brought all kinds of fresh herbs. They loved all of the fresh herbs. They even loved the vol au vent shells from France, the 35% cream. But when I seared the meat off, which was still so rare, okay, so raw, that it was making my sauce turn pink. Now this sauce is usually a golden brown with cream put into it. It's a really nice tan color. And I love that color, but it turned pinkish purplish because of, like I said, it was so raw. And they said, why did you cook the meat? And so, but that's what they're accustomed to. So their way of, when they had meat that was in excess, is they would put it on the ground and cover it with rocks. This is the way they would keep it from freezing so much. It would still freeze, but not as much. So it was, you were able to eat it. When we look at our indigenous cousins to the south, so let's say in Peru, because as I've said before, our, you know, there's a lot of borders in between, but we never put the borders there. We didn't cross them, they crossed sort of where we were. So when we look at our indigenous cousins to the south, they would catch a fish, and because it was tropical and warm, if they let the fish sit there, it would go bad. So they would, again, dig a hole in the ground and wrap it in a leaf of some type and use what was called a tombo fruit. And this tombo fruit was an acidic fruit. And so that would help preserve it and marinate it. Hence the first ceviche recipes were done in that way. And when we look at the West Coast, The method of drying, well, we talked already about the west coast of the gathering of the fish and how they went and caught it, but the drying of the salmon and the smoking of the salmon. So you're by a river, it's very windy, it's a fast moving river, there's always a wind there. It was a perfect place to dry it. And the other thing that some of the elders had said to me is that by drying the fish by the river, that the wind would carry the smell down, so animals wouldn't come and smell it and take it away. Because that was one of the things I said, how come it's the animals don't come and take it? They said, well, the wind carries it, and it was a constant breeze down there, I want to say. And then when we look at other people of gathering food from the Algonquins, of gathering tree sap or tree syrup, from birch syrup to maple syrup. We look at the Minnesota Ojibwe people in gathering the wild rice. When they gathered the wild rice was in a marsh. In order to go through a marsh, you needed a pointed boat, like a canoe. You took the wild rice, which actually is an aquatic seed, and you took a stick and knocked some into your canoe. You also turned the plant over and knocked some seeds into the ground so that you would have more plants next year. Again, that's sustainability, the way of life, looking after the earth. And then you would also leave some on the plants so that birds would come, because we are not here alone. Also, that if the birds came, I remember one of my uncles telling me this, that if the birds came, it wasn't just to feed them, it's so we can have birds too. Because he said, what did he say? He said, you don't want to be one of those vegetarian indigenous people. And in our language, we call them a bad shot. And I thought, I didn't get it, but I was learning. So one of the things that we look at when we're looking at the our communities is, what are we doing? What are we doing when we look at our way? We don't have to be indigenous to look after food the way we do to look after. So what are we doing for our community? Are we thinking of feeding people? And this is something that I've been so fortunate in my life to be in the job that I have. I am always giving things away. You know, knowledge was given to me to give away. So when I produce food, I'm giving it away. And not everybody likes what I make, and I'm okay with that now. I wasn't at first when I was a young aspiring chef. I really wanted to please everybody, and I tried and I did my best. Being part of the community, being able to give is fantastic. I'm trying to do small steps for the environment. By the way, not doing anything is not doing anything. So doing something small, okay, I'm going to do this. Right? One of the great things is that the water that we have, I didn't like our water. Now we got a filtration system, so I don't have to buy bottled water. Do I? I try not to. I did have. It's funny because my neighbor came over because I had some duck meat, and he was sampling, and he brought a bottle of water over. And I thought, "Hey, what are you doing?" I got water here. It's filtered water. He says, "I know, but I forgot." For our environment, what are we doing for our families, and what are we doing for our future? In our communities. Yeah, you know, the other thing that I like to say is that it's contagious. And I found this to be, in my opinion, the more I did something for people, sometimes people felt that they needed to, oh, I need to return this favor. No, you don't. And one of the most common things I always say is that when somebody says, what can I do for you? Just pass it on. That's one of the great things that I believe. You know, I remember learning a lesson, and I learned so many lessons from my mom. And I miss her so much, but she's alive in my heart. That was, I remember buying my mom a coat. And my mom saw this one coat and she says, I would love to have that coat. And it was expensive. And I thought, I'm going to save my money. I'm going to get that for my mom at Christmas. And I remember getting it for her. It was a downfill coat. It was a nice full length, and it was brand new, and she loved it. And I just remember her putting it on and her crying and hugging me and loving it and everything. And it was not even the next winter, and she gave it away. And I thought, I'm so upset at my mom. I cannot believe this. My mom is always giving things away. And I thought, she shouldn't have gave that away. I gave it to her. And then I stopped myself and I realized, well, that's who my mom was. And I remember sitting there saying, Mom, why did you give it away? And she said, this person goes to work every day. I'm not going out right now. I'm staying in for the winter. I don't need it. This person needs to go out there. And I'm sure they're going to give me something, or they'll give somebody else something. And I really thought, how can I get upset at my mom for teaching me that lesson of giving? And I have, like I said, one of the greatest jobs in the world. I get to give the knowledge that's been shared with me. I get to give food away, and people usually love you when you're giving away food, and I love that. And then now as a professor and a lecturer, I get to share the stories that have been shared with me. So I want to say it's the greatest feeling in the world. Now, I did promise you that I would post something because, again, in our news today, we had some challenging news to hear. But just before I go to that one page where I just took something off the internet, and I'm sure you can find a lot more. This is just one site that I found that I have some stuff on, but I wanted to say thank you for this fantastic opportunity. And really, when we look at how can we shape our future, looking back at how we did things, I believe is a fantastic way of perhaps slightly changing our future, so we're going in a different direction and looking after our planet. I don't want to move to Mars just yet. Not that I'm going to, but so this is the slide that I had, and this is the web page. Again, I just found this, and I just basically typed in, give me 10 things that I can do about this. And again, I'm not. These are just mere suggestions, but I wanted to have these down here to do something. So I put them up here. That is where I got the suggestions. And so I think on that note, I do want to say thank you for this great opportunity to share with you. I am Chef David Wolfman, and I will open up the floor to see if anybody has any questions. Oh, we're on Facebook. I didn't know we were on Facebook. Hello, David. Oh, we have a question.
Hello.
Oh, thank you. Let me see if I can open up my chat line. Maybe I'll do that now. Sorry, I didn't have it. Well, thank you, Bianca.
If anybody does have any questions and you'd rather speak it opposed to typing it in the chat, feel free to just put up your hand or raise your hand, and I'll see that on my end, and I'd be happy to activate your microphone. Okay, so we've got one from Bianca here. Chef?
Go ahead.
Hi, Chef.
Hey.
Amazing workshop, loved it. I just wanted to ask, I'm trying to teach children at a very young age about sustainability, and I run a breakfast club for the youth, and that they themselves are learning how to actually purchase products and also how to share, how to actually cook and have conversations around the table, which we found was missing. Are there any good literature, or is there any good literature that I can start students at a young age understanding more about the earth that you would recommend, and the importance of eating from the earth? Because I find that right now everybody's relying on processed and not realizing what they're putting into their body. Does that make sense?
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hope I was clear. I apologize.
Now, I don't know of any reading material. I could look it up and I could post it for you. But I've found, and I remember asking this question about that, and I remember, and I'm sure you're doing this already, is I do workshops all across the country, as a matter of fact, around the world now, which is fantastic. And I mean, pre-COVID, live workshops. And I remember bringing food and saying, okay, I want you to try this. And I remember poaching a chicken breast, and I did it with some vegetables and the liquid. I reduced it down, and I thickened it up with a little bit of arrowroot, put it on top of this poached chicken breast, and I remember somebody saying to me, "This is so tasty. I didn't think that boiled chicken would taste like this." And I thought, first of all, it's not boiled; it's poached, and there was a lot of flavors and herbs in there. And I said, "Is there too much salt in there?" And they said, "No, there isn't." And during the demo, I said, "Here's the salt. Here's what I'm going to do with the salt." And I put a cup on top of it. I'm going to do this without salt because I wanted to show them that they could taste it. And obviously, this particular gentleman didn't do that. And he says, "No, it's just the right amount of salt." I said, "I didn't use salt." "Yes, you did." I said, "Turn around and ask anybody." And so I found that by the method of taste this, try this, was the best way of teaching. Now, I guess that's just my way. So to answer your question, I don't know of any at the moment. I teach more. I want to say older kids, college kids. So
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Can I ask one more question?
Absolutely, you can ask as many questions as you want.
Sorry. On your website, you have a piece where it says for teachers, if they want to incorporate education, a curriculum, if they're interested, what age groups is that connecting to?
Are you talking about my website on Marlene's, right? That's my wife does curriculum development.
Oh, okay.
So, but she's done it for, I guess it was primary to grade 8 and also high school on reserve. She does curriculum development. Unfortunately, she's not here. She's next door. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Send an email and I can pass it on to Marlene, and I'm sure she can help you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, are there any other questions out there for the chef today? Feel free to say hello and ask your questions in the chat. Raise your hand. If you don't know how to raise your hand, click on the chat and say hey, and I'll unmute your mic there as well.
I hope I typed it in right, because once it disappears, hey, I typed it in right for a change. Thank you, Joy. Appreciate that.
I suppose I have a question, Chef. Do you have a favorite recipe that you would maybe, I know this is very common, but maybe one that would be recommended, for cooks at home who are trying to get more involved in the cooking process?
Well, I've been doing this one lately. Well, there's actually two I've been doing. A duck breast, where I'm actually just seasoning it with some salt, pepper, olive oil, and grilling it, starting in the cold pan and cooking it and serving it with a Three Sister relish, which is on my website, the recipe for that. And then nish kebabs, which is nish, abbreviated for Anishinaabe, slang abbreviation, that is. So I do a nish kebab, which I use venison. Pretty easy to do. You can do it in a barbecue. Probably the most challenging ingredient in that, which is also on my website, would be the birch syrup, which you could replace some molasses with.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll definitely check that out.
Bannock and white corn question. Go ahead.
So I'll unmute you there, Joy.
Hi there. Thank you so much, David. Just a couple questions, and I really love traditional type food, and I remember years ago in Toronto attending the Sportsman Show, and I went to this one area, and they had Indigenous food, and I had the best bannock, and I've tried to replicate it, looking at different recipes, but they come out like a tea bisque instead. How do you get the density in a bannock? So that's one question on that one. And the other one with the white corn was a white corn soup that was just incredible. And I've not been able to find anything since.
Yeah, well, the white corn soup, it's actually on our website too, I believe. The white corn is really difficult to find. The process they use is they use a lye, which is a chemical to remove it. The traditional way was hardwood ash. They boil the white corn in to remove the outer husk. But you can actually buy hominy corn, and I don't know if you're where you are, but I know in downtown Toronto, they have it in one of the food markets. And ironically, it's a European food market that I find it. So you can find the hominy corn, and that really adds the flavor with kidney beans and some bacon in there. It's really nice and a nice stock. Now the bannock is, I guess it's just the density. I mean, every different community you go to has a different type of bannock, on their menu. Some are yeast based, others is baking soda based.
Okay, that's interesting. And I guess the European meat market, that would be, or the European market would be in Kensington area?
St. Lawrence Market.
Oh, St. Lawrence Market, okay. Yeah, no, I'm in Prince Edward County, so I'll have to see if I can find something else this way.
Yeah, it's funny because I've been looking around and I found some, believe it or not, I found some in a Caribbean market once, a Caribbean store. Because I just happened to be passing through, I was buying some spices and I was in there and I thought, you guys have hominy corn? And they went, oh yeah, you should try it. I said, no, I love it. And I bought 4 cans because I'm always doing cooking classes where I'm using it. So.
Excellent. Well, I'll have to look for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Oh, well, Metro here, I'm not sure. That'd be good. I'll have to look. Not our Metro store, but our Metro store doesn't carry fresh produce even. That fresh. Okay. Our local one. Okay, I think we're all done with the questions. So again, I'd like to take this chance to say thank you again. Thank you for coming by and asking questions, and have a fantastic day. Just see if there's anything else.
Thanks again, Chef, for joining us today. It was a very thoughtful and educational chat, and I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody else really enjoyed it. So thank you for joining us today.
Okay, and have a fantastic day. And,
thank you. You as well.
And take good care.
You too. Take care, everyone.